content of this episode is about residential and day schools. This subject may be upsetting to some listeners and may be triggering for those who have been affected by these traumas.
Welcome to Kahnawake Collective Impact's podcast, KCI Kindled, creating space for meaningful dialogue. The goal of this podcast is to open up a safe space for community members to have conversations about current social issues, both intercommunity and global issues, culture and heritage, and language. This space encourages respectful expression of different opinions and perspectives. The opinions and perspectives expressed belong to the guests of the show and do not reflect those of KCI.
Have you ever been gaming or working online classes and your internet service constantly gets interrupted? First Nations Fiber is about to ensure that just won't happen again. Get ready for high speed at a new level. Click on fnfiber.com and sign up today. First Nations Fiber, empowering people through connectivity.
Welcome to the pilot episode of KCI Kindled. We still have some kinks that we're trying to smooth out for you guys. My name is Karina Peterson. I am the communications coordinator at Kahnawake Collective Impact, and we have our co-host, Denon Phillips.
Hello.
And we have a guest in studio with us today. We have Wahesu Whitebean.
Gwekwe.
Wahesu is the education research coordinator at the Kahnawake Education Center and a PhD candidate at McGill University.
So today's topic, the reason why we have her in studio with us is we're discussing residential schools and how it's affected multi-generational families and education. And Wahesu has a background in that, which is why we have her today. So I guess just to start off, just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you are, knowledge of residential schools and why you chose this path.
Gwekwe. So my name is Wahesu Cheyenne Whitebean. So some of you know me as Wahesu Sama Cheyenne growing up. I'm from Kahnawake. I'm Wolf Clan. I have 3 kids and my partner Merrick is from here. And so not many people know that some of my family is also from Akwesasne. And so I have Indian residential school survivors in my family on my mother's side. And like most people here, I have a lot of Indian day school survivors or former students in my family as well. And so I've been in university for close to a decade now as a full-time student. I did my 3 degrees back to back. And I started out at Concordia doing my BA in First People Studies. And so that's kind of where this whole thing started, working on Indian residential school, Indian day school, and that whole educational history. So it went from there. I did my master's degree. I did an individualized program. So I just built my own master's degree. And I did an oral history project on the day schools here, which is really limited in scope because, it was a master's. So I could only work with 4 elders. Mm-hmm. So at the present time, I'm a PhD candidate at McGill in the Department of Integrated Studies and Education. And I'm doing my doctoral research on Indian day schools here. And I'm doing a comprehensive study of the history of Indian day schools. And so it connects with Indian residential schooling, and there's a lot of overlapping, especially in families as well. And so that's kind of what I do. And then I work at the Kahnawake Education Center as the education research coordinator. I chair the ethics committee. I co-authored the first research policy and code of ethics for the ed system, mm-hmm. which is we newly implemented. So thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Well, thank you for coming on. We're family. We're related. We're cousins. And I've always known that you've been in school for a really long time, but I think this is like the first time I'm hearing about all the studies that you've actually been doing, and it's amazing. So the goal or the path of this show is really just to have a conversation about the residential schools and day schools, and I guess to specifically connect it to Kahnawake here and how we've been kind of dealing with the traumas from it, what the day schools and residential schools actually are, and maybe some of the positive changes that kind of came out of it. I know it sounds a little bit crazy to talk about residential schools and positive changes, but we have seen a shift in education. We have seen some changes in our community. We have seen healing. So those are all some positive things that are just happening from this now because we are progressing and moving forward. So I guess to begin the conversation is maybe to just talk about a little bit of the history or what is a residential school? What is a day school for some of our listeners who are tuning in? maybe they don't have knowledge or background, or maybe it's just something that they don't know about yet. So I'm wondering if you'd be able to give us a little bit of what is it? What is a day school? What is a residential school?
So to start out, more people are familiar with Indian residential school, let's just say in the general public. So Indian residential schools were also known as boarding schools or industrial schools, especially in the States. So we use residential school more commonly here in Canada, so-called Canada. And so these are institutions that were created purposefully for the assimilation and conversion of Indigenous children. And so it's widespread across North America. And that's what Indian day schools have in common with residential schools. Same program, same purpose, operated by, religious orders, different, religious denominations. And the main difference between the two being that at an Indian residential school, children, they locate the schools far away from the community on purpose so that the families don't have access to the children. And so children would be taken. Ordinarily, it was a forced removal through compulsory attendance policies, especially once the Indian Act came in force. So when you're talking about the Indian Act coming into play in 1876, you see in the late 1880s this proliferation of Indian day schools, Indian residential schools being developed. And that's where there's a shift. Prior to that, there's something they like to call mission schools. When you do this kind of research and this kind of work, they'll say a mission school. And they mean the earlier day schools. Mostly they were in day schools or seasonal schools that religious authorities would open in communities, and it would just kind of be out of their own pocket and through their own effort. Once there's federal policy backing these institutions, they become federal Indian day schools. And so that's kind of a difference. And so that they had the same objective and the same purpose, and that was to just for cultural erasure, language loss. So at these institutions, the vast majority, children were forbidden from speaking their language and so on. I guess we'll get into that in conversation a little bit more about what happened at the schools. So those are the main three: mission school, Indian day school, and Indian residential school. And there is something called a day scholar. And when you hear that term in the media or, maybe you read about it, what they're referring to is not actually a day school. They're referring to children who went to an Indian residential school for the day, but they returned home at the end of the day. So those individuals weren't eligible to apply for the Indian residential school settlement agreement. So there's all of these rules around eligibility and all of these different terms that are used. But essentially, these places are created for the same purpose.
So the day school, at least they get to go home at the end of the day, but it's still the same thing that's being implemented in the classroom.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's the same type of curriculum, same policy, same objective, and that's one of the special things about doing Indian day school research is that because the children were in the community, when you talk to someone, especially some of the elders we have in the community today that I've talked with who are older, let's say in their 80s and 90s, so they were in a much earlier period of day schooling, you get a picture and that context of what's happening in the community at the time. Not just what they knew that happened in the school. They give you this kind of condensed life story. And then you really start to understand how big the system was and how much power they had over the people. And I think that's really important. And that's one of the main differences between Indian residential school and Indian day school is, you get a lot more of a deeper understanding of the community, the picture of what's happening in the community at the time.
In a way, because residential schools sent the children off reserve, it's almost like the communities were kind of able to preserve, I guess, a little bit of culture, of tradition, because, it's not great that the children were taken away, but when you think of day school, like you said, it's like a community-wide thing now. So now it's happening in the community now. So it's almost like it's at the heart. The kids are our heart, so wherever they go, that's where the heart goes, right? But I could see how that's a little bit how it makes a difference to have a day school right here, like for example in Kahnawake, and then the whole community just has to abide by that, and how much it changes everything.
Absolutely. And people have a tendency, I think it's natural, to compare the two. So they're everyone wants to, when you present them with new information, you want to understand it based on whatever kind of knowledge you already possess. And so people know about residential schools, so they'll ask me to compare a lot. And so there was approximately, I know they estimated around 150,000 children went to Indian residential school throughout its history. And those are estimates. And there was approximately 40,000 claimants in the Indian residential school survivor, the whole settlement process in Canada. And so by comparison, they say there's about double the Indian day school, the number of Indian day school people, either survivors or former students. I use both of those terms, survivor and former student, because not everyone wants to be called a survivor. I think there's, we could have a whole other conversation about that sort of language of victimization and the language the court uses and how they determine, that you survived something or that you're eligible for compensation. But some people don't like me to refer to them as a survivor. So I say both, just not to be inclusive. So in comparison, if more than twice the number of Ngwehongwe people went to day school, by comparison, we know very little about their experience. And so I started working on this before the settlement was approved. I started working on this topic as an undergrad. So it's just a kind of a coincidence that it became this hot topic all of a sudden in research or in the media. But for me, it was about something completely different, my motivations.
The day school, when was the last time it was around?
I officially, on the books, they consider the schools in Kahnawake as Indian day schools up to 1988.
1988.
Yeah.
And what made the change from it becoming, or from day school to not being considered a day school anymore?
Well, that change really started in Kahnawake specifically in 1969. And that was what they call the Joint Unification Agreement. So there used to be two different school boards, a Catholic and a Protestant school board for the different schools, denominational schools. And when they united the two and said, finally, and I see this in the archives. I do a lot of archival research. For many, many years, for decades, the community fought, trying to have a non-denominational school, a unified school for the kids, and to no avail. They fought for a lot of things that never came to be. So when this finally occurred in 1969, there was a big shift. So the schools shifted from, there was a girls' and a boys' school, Roman Catholic, like RC for short, and they shifted into Cattery School. So it was this big shift. So the kids, the people who were in school at that time in 1969 went from wearing a uniform and going to that school to no uniforms and going to Cattery School. And it was still the same building from what I understand, but there was a shift. But for a while after that, there were still nuns here. So my generation, I'm the tail end of the transition generation. I'm a claimant in the settlement, having started school in the 80s. There were still some nuns left, and I've talked to people in their 40s. I'm almost 40, so who were taught by a nun, and so had experiences that are similar to a lot of other people who were taught by nuns. So you're not talking about something in the distant past. You're talking about generations of people living today who live through this. And so those are the kinds of experiences that and the kind of stories that I'm listening to and I'm seeking out right now in the community. I'm actually doing interviews and archival research right now. So that's part of my research for McGill.
I didn't know that about Cattery School, about the girls' school and the boys' school. And it's so apparent now because on Facebook, there's a group, Kahnawake Old Photo Share. And you see a lot of these old class photos popping up from like the 40s, the 50s, the 60s. And they are wearing uniforms and they are all girls in the photo or all boys in the photo. And it never clicked until just now. I'm like you, I'm at the tail end of that era of day schools, I guess, but I didn't have experience with nuns in there. They were already gone by the time I had started, but I have a sibling that went through it, an older sibling. So yeah, it really is just like yesterday. It feels like yesterday. It hasn't been that long.
And even when they did the switch in the 70s, my mom went to school in the 70s, and a lot of people around that time said that the schoolyard was still divided. Boys and girls. You weren't allowed on one half of the schoolyard. And so some of those old ideologies persisted into like the 70s and the 80s. And it's taken us quite a while to, we basically had to rebuild curriculum and from the ground up. It's day schools were springboards into either public schooling, because in some communities when day schools closed or residential schools closed, the kids were sent to off reserve if there was no community school, and they were sent to public schools. In communities like ours, they were springboards into community education. And so one of the things I do when I do presentations and talks about this, I like to show an old photo of Cattery School from 1928 And then I show a photo in the same location I took of Kahnawake School myself.
Mm-hmm.
And then I show my school photos just to demonstrate to people that, this school just sort of morphed into a community school. But many people in the community that have shared their stories with me talk about maybe they have children or grandchildren in the school today, that they physically feel sick being in the building or approaching the building. Some people have PTSD and so on. And so that's powerful. I like to challenge those ideas that, I hear a lot of comments I see a lot of comments online, like get over it and let it go. And it's been a long time and it hasn't really been a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's exactly where multi-generational trauma comes into play with this now, because just because the school got a facelift and they did all these renovations and made additions, that original school is still there. Those hallways are still there. All those experiences are still there. It doesn't just erase what happened just because the school looks different. When I went there, that basement was terrifying. There were all these scary stories about nuns, ghosts of nuns going up and down the stairs, and it's haunted, not actually with, maybe it is with spirits. It depends on what you believe
it's
in.
Haunted in other ways.
It's haunted in traumatic experience. For sure, this all plays into multi-generational trauma, and there's that other word for it.
Intergenerational, historic trauma.
Yes, yes, for sure.
Absolutely. And that's one of the questions. I get asked weird questions sometimes by people, and they'll say, one of the questions I was asked when I did the master's, the first study, people wanted to know, if we had so many day schools, why were some of our kids sent to residential school? And so that was a question I had on my mind, why? And so I learned by doing some archival research that for the most part, the kids who ended up in the residential school system who were from here were either kids who were labeled troublemakers. So residential schools was held over the heads of parents and children as a threat. Not just residential school, but it could have been detention centers and later on, child welfare and so on, those kind of institutions. The residential schools were the threat for a long time. If you don't behave and do what we tell you, then you could be sent away. The other thing was there was a lot of poverty. And so I learned a lot about that doing this work, both through the stories, also through the archive. But if your family was severely impoverished, if you were, say, a woman was widowed, maybe you were orphaned as a child, you would be sent to Indian residential school. So there was all these different reasons. And so I saw accounts of that in the archive. So there was a number of different schools, and depended on, the gender of the child, because you had to either go to girls' school or boys' school. Some of them were industrial schools. So like Mount St. Elgin, Spanish. And I was really curious why children from here would be sent all the way to Spanish. And it was because it was Catholic here, was dominated by Roman Catholic Jesuits, for example, and then the Sisters of St. Anne.
Yep.
The Jesuits here reached out to the Jesuits who ran Spanish and said, you need to take these kids because they have nowhere to go or no one to feed them. And over there, the response was, we're overwhelmed and we can hardly feed the kids we have. And they said, if you don't take them, they literally have nowhere to go. So they took children. When the bridge disaster happened, that was a big blow to the community. All of these women were widowed. It was perceived as, a terrible thing, like you were helpless if you were widowed. How are you going to make ends meet? When it was the males who were considered head of household and so on.
Yeah.
So the only support the government would offer when the families asked for support was they said, well, we could take your kids and put them in residential school. So some of those children, presumably, I don't see the names. Occasionally I do see names, but some of those children went to school, Indian residential school as a result. So parents, did everything they could for their kids.
And was the residential schools where we're also being kind of sold to them too, right? They're going to learn how to write, how to read, how to
school.
It
was kind of sold to them that it was good for them to go, right? Also
to parents, but for the most part, there's kind of a mix of things that happen. One is that parents didn't necessarily resist their children being educated or learning another language. They didn't like the idea. Our people understood the ideology of these people and what they really wanted and what
the
they were
intention
doing.
was.
Yeah. And there's multiple complaints. Like when I say I'm doing archival research, right now I'm going through Library and Archives Canada microfilms.
Yeah.
I have tens of thousands of pages that I have to go through. And I've just on the weekend, I went through 1,500 pages of documents and photos. And so it's a huge project. And so it goes by, they're categorized by school and by different eras.
Mm-hmm.
And so I learned so much about the inner workings. Like I get to, there's some stories I heard growing up, and then I get to actually read about it in detail. And that's one thing I can say is a lot of the oral history I heard growing up and the stories in the community matched with things that I saw in the archive. Not in the detail that I see it, but it's there. And so the people did everything they could all the way through, the people in this community, to fight against the sisters coming. They would use sometimes kind of passive resistance if they could. I think that one of the things that is often misunderstood is the kind of environment that we lived in at the time, our people lived in at the time in Kahnawake. The Indian agent and the religious orders had control, total control. So, you really didn't have power. I see complaints from parents about abuses in school, and nothing is ever done about it. Over and over. I see once they created the band council system, the Indian Act, the band council tries to interject on matters of education many times and advocate for the kids. The response is usually, most of you people are illiterate and you don't know anything and you don't have a say. And also that the band council has no jurisdiction over educational matters. And so that's one thing I'll tell people is that parents tried, families tried.
It's just everything was working against
everything
against us.
Mm-hmm.
My grandfather, both my grandparents were part of the day school here, Cattery School. It affected my grandfather's family. He's the one that spoke to me a little bit about it. And he's 89 years old. And he's always been a super strong, silent type of stoic native man. A little bit scared of him. Like if you're like when you're a little kid, right? Like he's going to yell at you or something. But oh my God, he started talking like in the past 5 years or so. He just started telling me all these stories and telling me all these things. And his family came from a first language speaking household. Like, that we share the same great grandmother.
Mm-hmm.
He told me that as a kid, being sent to day school and having to learn English and not allowed to use your language and all these things, his mother did not speak English at all. He understands it. He's also like a first language speaker, but the multi-generational trauma part of it was that he did not pass the language on to his own kids. Or my grandmother, he never spoke to any of his kids in Kahnawake ever. And he said that's because they were brought up or they were taught to believe that it was useless. English was the language, French was the language. The way that he kind of put it was that he didn't want his kids to learn the language and have a hard time with it later. He wanted to give his kids the best shot out there. So that's why he kept the language out of his family. They had 10 children and none of them speak. And then what happens after that? None of the grandchildren speak. I don't have language. None of us have language. There's 30 something grandchildren and none of us have language. And now our kids don't have language. But now it's changing a little bit. Like this generation of kids coming up, it's a little bit different from our grandparents, right? Like there's positive changes happening. But that's just how much that whole mindset, you don't have power, the government's against you, your council can't advocate for you, the religion is just so hard. That's how much it infiltrated even family systems and then trickled down like 3 generations after that.
Oh, we're still there in terms of, well, what's more important, language or giving your kids a chance to, I guess, see the world? And what better way to do that than learn English, learn French, learn another language, except, Kahnawake, which is important to us, but it can only go so far outside the community. I mean, that's a stretch.
Yeah. So there's all these different things, right, that are still coming at us. I mean, it all depends on what you value. Can we have our language? There's a lot of cultures out there that speak like 4 or 5 different languages. Yeah. They're rich in their own culture, but yet they could still participate in the rest of the world. Mm-hmm. And it still kind of seems like it's black or white for us. It's either you live in your own culture, but I mean, it's symbolic too with our wampum and everything else, to the canoe. Mm-hmm. It's so political. That's the only way I could think of it, is like, it's difficult to navigate through this.
Mm-hmm. And some of those decisions that people made, because that comes up a lot in my interviews with people in our conversations about day schooling. So sometimes I'll hear that a lot, that, that version of things that they were told, like, it's worthless and it's just all about English. So there's a sort of idea that, well, my kids will be better off because they faced hardship. But also some of those families, those people were abused in school when they used the language here. And so they're thinking, I'm protecting my kids. So there's that whole mentality as well. And so, since we are related, and Karina shared that story about that's my great uncle, her grandfather. My mother was raised by that family. So his mother, my great great grandmother, raised my mom from a newborn. So my mom was raised in a first language home. And that was my first home I lived in when I was born. My mom was a teen mom. So our great great grandma was still alive when I was born, and I lived there. She named me Wahesu, and she couldn't speak the language. So, she couldn't speak English. She only was Osko in the house. And so living there as a baby, I must have been, hearing the language. And we had to move when I was still a baby. So my mother could speak the language. And then later on, when they introduced language into the schools here in the 70s, she was one of those kids in the school who started to get to learn Kahnawake. So she could read and write a little bit. So my mother eventually having, if you're raised by your great grandmother, you lose her early in your life because of age. So she ends up not having anyone to speak to because she was raised by these older generations of people. So she loses the language. And so then I always felt a little bit robbed and angry that I didn't have it because I was so close, because I lived in a first language home. It actually was Istahum named me Wahesu. And that's why for years, I've used my Kahnawake name to reclaim it. And I do a lot of language work in the community and language projects with the KEC. So for me, that's part of the healing of all of that. So this isn't an easy thing to talk about, right? Or present about, even if it's on the outside. It's always kind of difficult in a way. You can't put a positive spin on something that's just really ugly and hurtful. But I do try to take a strength-based approach, and I'm always highlighting to people the changes we made in the ed system and how hard people fought for that. And now I can see just how long, just on the weekend, looking at 1,500 pages of documents over and over, people will still speak up, even though they were, always silenced. Our people would still speak up and try. They would say, I see these council resolutions that say, we want our people in the schools teaching our kids. We don't want the nuns. When they brought the nuns here in 1914, the Sisters of St. Anne, that was actually Duncan Campbell Scott. So he's one of the big bad guys in that Indian Act history that people are familiar with his name. He personally reached out to the Archbishop of Montreal and said, I want a religious order. I want nuns to come to what they called Kahnawake at the time to work in the schools. And the Archbishop said, well, I'm not in charge of the Grey Nuns, but I know there's a few other orders. He put him in touch with the Sisters of St. Anne and brought them here. And the people, when they got word of it, right away objected. And they did a petition. They actually did 2 different petitions, which had close to 200 signatures on one of them of community members here. And some of the papers in Montreal picked up the story at the time to say, the Indians are protesting.
Wow. Of course.
It was so big, back then. And they still brought them here. And again, the Indian agent and the truancy officer had a lot of power in the community. They had the most power. A truancy officer was like a constable. If you didn't put your kid in school, he could come knocking on your door, arrest you, beat you, fine you. And this is the way that it was. And there were people here where that happened. So those things did happen. So it was enforced. Compulsory attendance was enforced. So the sisters came, and that drastically changed things. And that was a big shift in terms of anglicizing the community, because a lot of them were American, English-speaking American nuns. Yeah. There was the big shift. So the shift now after ed reform started is to really put at the center of our education system, we have the curriculum. That was Kateruni Iris Stacy and the curriculum team at the KEC, put that together, and we've been implementing it in the schools. So now that's the core curriculum. So our culture and our ways are at the core. It means helping the teachers with cultural knowledge because there's gaps.
Yeah, for sure. There's got to be some trainings or some just trying to get our teachers living it also so that they can teach it. Yeah, like you were mentioning, strengths based. That's kind of like you said. This is so dark. The history around this is just so dark. But if we concentrate on those strength based things, like there has been like a reform, I guess, in a way, with the way that we're educating our own children here now. But we're also kind of seeing it outside of the reserve, like outside schools throughout Canada now, that residential schools and day schools actually make it into curriculum. Whereas before, of course, it wasn't. The history of Canada and Quebec in a nutshell was complete garbage. So we are seeing a little bit of change in, I guess, I don't want to say the right direction, but in a more informed direction.
Yeah, we're talking about it.
Yeah, exactly.
There's more talk about it.
There's conversation. Just talking about religion in schools too. I mean, I was looking up yesterday before this to see when they actually cut it out, because day school seemed like it happened yesterday, like the 80s, right? Religion in schools, they decided to scrap it from public schools in 1997. That's a long time for religion to stay in schools, because I remember being at Cattery School and there was Catholic class, Protestant class, and then Longhouse class. So every time there was religion, you would just separate into your other classes, which is crazy, right? Like there's a Longhouse class when we're all Native children and we all should be engrossed in that education as well. But we were separated in terms of religion, which was crazy now that I'm thinking about it. It's like bananas, you know?
You sort of, when we talked about it yesterday, about religious class or religion class, I kind of forgot about it. It was one of those things. Oh yeah, I did go to church when I was in school, but I didn't go because I wanted to. I went because it was in school. And I didn't think
we had to.
Yeah, we had to. I didn't even think about it. All right, well, I guess we got it. It's one of the classes I got to pass. But how do you pass religion? I don't know. Just go and eat the wafer, and you'll be all right.
You had to make communion first before you did that. See, I still remember I did all those things. Communion, confirmation. I remember once they brought us in to do penance or make penance, like sit in the box with the priest and confess your sins. You're 10 years old. What sins have you committed? Like, I'm not religious and whatever. I'm not religious now, but back then we were just doing this blindly because someone kind of told us that we had to do it. So it's like, it's unfathomable to think that we had that in the school, in a public school. I know now private schools are still allowed to stay religious, like there are still private religious schools that exist out there. But in the public school, again, that was only 30 years ago that they took it out. So like that's another change, I guess, that we've seen in education in general. I had a point, but I'm not sure I was going with it.
Well, you're saying like 30 something years, almost 25. The last residential school that closed down was in 1996.
They often say 1996, and I've heard from a few Indigenous people that they knew of a school up until 98. Okay. So we're talking 96 and 98. That's very recent.
So how did that come to an end for residential schools? Why was that the last one, and what caused it to finally end?
Well, it was actually in the 1960s. Gradually over time, you have to understand residential schools were very expensive to operate. So the department wanted to assimilate Indigenous people, but in the cheapest way possible. So you'll often see that if you look in the records, they say no to a lot of requests. So schools were underfunded, teachers were underpaid, and they're constantly advocating for either for things or salary increases. And the department will say there's no money. And so they preferred Indian day schools in the long run because they're cheaper. And so there was a couple of other things that happened over time in the 1900s. So sometimes people will say, how did everyone allow this to happen? How did they allow a place like a residential school to continue to operate decade after decade, right? So for one, the Indigenous families had no power and no say. So it wasn't that they didn't speak up or try, they did. But again, they had no control. And then in the public, they would often put all these little bulletins and whatnot and saying like, look what we're doing, we're saving the savages and all of these kind of things, use this kind of language. So there was a big propaganda kind of campaign that they would use. And they used to do here in the community as well. bring busloads of visitors to come, and they'd have the kids put on a show. So these things were allowed to, the impression that they got, the general public, was that this was a good thing. This was like a charitable thing. They're being good Christians by, helping these poor uncivilized savages. And so the public they weren't overly concerned or invested, but there were whistleblowers, and some of them were staff at the schools who didn't like what they saw, couldn't live with it. But the big name that you'll hear about, like in the history books or in the public, is Dr. Peter Bryce. So Dr. Bryce, I think he died around 1932. So he was active in his career from the late 1880s into the early 1900s. He was the chief medical officer for the department. So he had to go around school to school, and he gathered all these statistics, and it was deplorable when he realized how many kids were sick, how many children were dying in these institutions, and he called it out, and then he advocated for it. Once he knew this, and once he saw the treatment with his own eyes, he just couldn't live with it. So he made it his mission to call it out, and they completely ruined his career and his reputation completely. Mm-hmm. So if they could do that to a white man who was a doctor in the early 1900s, they could do anything to anyone. And so he's someone who you'll often hear Cindy Blackstock speak about. So she's the child and family rights, Indigenous child and family rights advocate, and she's leading that whole movement to call the Canadian government to justice for all the wrongs that have been committed against Indigenous children through child welfare practices. Mm-hmm. And she talks about Bryce a lot. And she actually went to his grave, and she'll say, like, in the long run, he was right, and he was telling the truth, and he tried. So these things happened at times, right? So it finally ends up, they start closing the schools. They're expensive to operate. The buildings are falling apart. And so there was just kind of limited schools here and there once you get into the 1960s, because they shifted practices and they started doing what they call a 60 scoop. So instead of putting children into residential institutions or just Indian day schools, they said, they started putting children into non-native foster homes and adoptive homes. Mm-hmm. And so that's when a whole shift happened in assimilation in terms of that forced removal of kids from communities. And that happened a lot here. My mom was actually a 60 scoop survivor. And that's how she ended up being raised by her great-grandmother, because she was a 60 scoop baby, and mine and Karina's great-great-grandmother wouldn't accept it, that her great-granddaughter was going to be adopted out. So she and her daughter fought for my mom and advocated for her and raised her in community. And that's my sister's film, Rose, just came out. That's inspired by my mom's story. Mm-hmm. And so this is how the schools, they didn't really close. And Cindy Blackstock has an article, and I quote, "Did residential schools really close or just morph into child welfare?"
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That just gave me chills because it's true. We see it here in our own community. Like our community services has a hard time finding foster parents mm-hmm. within the community to place children that need placement. So a lot of our kids are actually being sent off the reserve now. Mm-hmm. Ooh, that's...
Yeah. And there's more Indigenous children in child welfare institutions today than there were at the height of Indian residential schools. So when I do this work, because I have done some research on that as well, because I was curious as an undergrad, why are we overrepresented? What is actually happening in child welfare? So I learned some things, and the number one cause for removal is neglect. And so it's not, when you use terms like Indigenous, like it's very pan-Indigenous, right? Mm-hmm. But what it actually comes down to, the overrepresentation is often, the category First Nations kids. So status First Nations kids on reserves. Okay. And the stats are higher in certain provinces like Saskatchewan and Manitoba and places like that, where they're actually putting foster kids in hotels because there's nowhere else to put them. Those kinds of things were happening. So when I do this work on Indian day schools, I talk about child targeted assimilation. So it's just a term that I use to address the pattern in the history. So I never talk about day schools when I do a presentation without mentioning child welfare. And I'll show day school, residential school, 60 scoop, and the millennium scoop. And I'll say, so this isn't a thing you can couch in the past. This is a pattern. These are institutions that are part of a bigger system and structure. Granted, people like to say, I can't be held accountable for what my grandparents did or my ancestors, or get over it. But if you have a conscience, if you care about that history, I know some part of us, sometimes you wish we could have done something. Why didn't someone do anything? You can do something for Indigenous children and families today, because the number one cause of removal that's cited by social workers is neglect. So I got into neglect. Like, what do you mean by neglect? And I went looking into the stats. Most of the time, it's a result of poverty. So what you end up doing is, because either perhaps a single mother can't be there, so the child's alone because she's working or something.
Yeah.
The house is in poor condition. There's not enough food. These kinds of things. So instead of addressing the conditions
The
of
larger
poverty,
issues around that.
exactly, they apprehend the children, put them into foster homes where they pay the foster parents, or an institution is paid. And today you get a pension if you're a foster parent.
Yeah.
And so instead of somehow diverting those funds to support services for families, this is what happens. And so there's a lot of other things. Sometimes it's justified to remove a child from a home.
Yeah.
But there has to be more support. There has to be more recognition of the multi-generational effects of all of this, because in Kahnawake, I can tell you there's a lot of change. Just when I did the first study that I finished in 2019, when I sat with those elders, they said, this is the first time I told anybody my day school story.
Mm-hmm.
That's what they told me. They said, I never told anyone this much. And I spent, whole days with some of them, and we got really deep. And I felt really connected to them. And, I had to be equally vulnerable and open. And it was like a really beautiful thing.
Mm-hmm.
And now that I'm doing this study and I'm talking to a lot more people in different generations, I find that because of the settlement, it kind of broke things open in a way. So there's pros and cons. So there are some people who weren't ready yet, either to talk or to accept that this happened.
Mm-hmm.
And then they did because of the settlement. And that settlement can be re-traumatizing. But I find now when I sit with people, they're kind of primed. So in the past, where it was like this whole almost therapeutic session we did, and many of the people I sit with, I sit down with them and they're like, they already have been talking about this and they've already thought about it a lot, and they know exactly what they want to tell me. And so on average, I spend an hour with a person and they just go and they're like, I think that's it. And so they're all like primed now, most of the people I speak to. There are still a few who, usually the more difficult, terrible things, people will tell me off the record, sort of off the recorder. So those are difficult. It's not easy for me to sit with someone sometimes and hear all of that out. And I'm patient, and a person's well-being is the most important thing. So I never ask pointed questions about abuse. When I sit with someone, I just tell them, I'm just here I want to hear what school was like for you, what your life was like at that time, and whatever you want to tell me, I'm willing to hear. And we go from there. And that's kind of the way that it goes. In a lot of families too, families like ours, there's layers there, right? Residential school, day school. In my family, there's all of it. So I'm trying to tell people, all of these things happen to us. It doesn't feel like separate, and it doesn't feel like it's over to me. And that's why I do the work that I do. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the ways people say, how do you process this? Like, how do you live with it?
Yeah, that was going to be like one of the questions that I bring up, is that to be able to listen to all those stories have to be, like you said, it's hard to hear it, hard to hold that space for people, because you have to be vulnerable as well. Mm-hmm. What do you do for your own wellness after that? Like, how do you process whatever feelings you may have that come out of that as well?
Mm-hmm. I think in one sense, I'm a little bit desensitized because I've done this for so long and I've heard so many things. But every now and then it comes up. All of a sudden there's a lump in your throat. And so I do a lot of physical activity. Actually, doing that first study kind of changed my life in a lot of ways. Like, it was an amazing transformation for me. Mm-hmm. Amazing realization. And one of the reasons is because sitting with people and hearing them talk about, especially the violence. One person I sat with, his name was Frank. When he had, it was the most difficult interview I did. There was just a lot of violence and a lot of abuse. But when he talked about the anger and how this happened in the schools, and his parents experienced it in the schools, and his grandparents. And then he said, you go out in the community. He said, say you misbehaved in school and they tell your father, he might beat you up when you come home. This was his reality.
Yeah.
And he said then out in the community, if the RCMP were around, they could do whatever they want. There was a curfew at times, different things. He said, so there was a culture of violence and it became normalized. So there was just violence everywhere you were witnessing or experiencing. And sitting and listening and talking through all of that, I just realized I was recontextualizing things that happened in my life and in my family through the generations.
Mm-hmm.
It was like I suddenly was able to actually see the root of it all. And I was going back through it because, a lot of people need to focus on the good and the positive. And I do language work. I went to Radiwan Hanirats. But there's a grief in language work.
Mm-hmm.
Because if we don't address the grief of it and we don't finally break the silence and tell the truth, we're not going to help people heal, especially the ones who are hanging on to very dark stories and very dark things. And now in the community, I'm that day school person, right? So sometimes people would just approach me at the post or at an event and say, like, you know what? And tell me a story. And one person told me their father was kind of stoic and gruff and cold their whole life. And then only now he's opened up and told them, like, this is what I seen in school. This is what happened to me in school. And now they understand why they were the way they were. And I had that understanding. I had that realization. And I was able to forgive people in my family a lot more easily, and it was easier to have the conversations, to understand where they're coming from. So that was like a powerful change for me. So I do a lot of physical activity now. It helps. I also talk to elders. So the way you would maybe go see a therapist, because I'm traditional and I was raised longhouse most of my life from when I was a kid, I sit with an elder, a community elder, and we have sessions and we could just talk about whatever I want. I've tried talking to a therapist, but I just prefer the elder.
It's not the same.
No, I get the spiritual and the cultural, and then I get the wisdom. And it's just what I need.
I've recently had a conversation with an elder. I've never actually met her before. She's a mom of somebody that I know, but I met her for the first time, and I swear to God, it was like a mirror. She knew me right off the bat. She knew everything about me. She knew exactly who I was. And then she was just spouting all this stuff that she heard me saying, but I'm not processing. She's like, you literally just said this. Mm-hmm. You literally just said that. Why don't you take your own advice or what? She's just, I swear that the conversation with that woman in that 30-minute time span that I met with her was so much more meaningful than I'm not saying that counseling is a bad thing. It's really not. Mm-hmm. But for certain things, my spirit felt like it was satisfied after I spoke with this person, because she knows my family. She knows my upbringing. She knows my mom. She knew everything about me. I can't hide from her. So if you go to a counselor, they don't know anything about you except for what you tell them.
Well, the conversation
is different.
It feels more natural when you're talking to an elder anyway. Like when you go see counseling, you're making yourself go do that. But when you're sitting with an elder, it's just like a conversation you're having, and that's the medicine.
Yeah.
And that set the tone. My first interview set the tone for all of this for me, because the very first interview I did about day schools was with Joe McGregor. Mm-hmm. So we all know Joe. We love Joe, right? And I'm best friends with one of his daughters. And, I've known him my whole life in a certain way as an elder. And so I heard him speak one time, when he does an opening, and he talked about day school. And so on the side, I said, hey, Joe, do you mind that we sit and talk about your day school experience? I heard you mention it. And so, I get a call one day out of the blue, and it's Amelia McGregor. And she says, come over, Joe's ready right now. Right now? So I'm like, okay. So I pack up all my stuff, and I'm like, I trained for this. I'm a grad student. I'm going to go do this interview. And so I did the interview with Joe, and it was one of those situations where he said, I never told anybody this. And he talked about the difficulties he had. And there was this moment where he told me that he was sitting in school and the feelings he had, the things he went through. He said, I made a decision then that I was going to be a natural person, that this wasn't for me, and that my life was going to be different. And he said, sayong guayera, we should be natural people. And he talked about if a rock rolls off a hill and just falls there and no one touches it, and it's natural. And so I felt like he was trying to say, that we shouldn't have been touched. We should have been left alone. Just be who we are. And And so that's why he led the life in the end that he led. A big part of it was school. So after I do my interview with him, and I know, it was in the evening, and I said, I know you want to feed the horses, so I'm going to get out of your way. And Joe says, no. You heard my story. Now you sit down, and I'm going to tell you what I see. And so we had this whole session, like a healing session. And I was so worried that I was like worried about, the people I'm working with, and I'm doing this story work, not to upset them or hurt them. That was my frame of mind going in. And I only realized afterwards, they were treating me like I was their grandchild, all these elders. And he said to me, I don't want you to leave here because of what I told you and for you to have a heaviness in your chest. So we're going to talk it out. And we did. He not only did that, but he did what you would expect of an elder, right? He told me what I should be doing with my life, about my purpose, all of those things. And when I left Joe's house, I don't live that far. I live in like South Texas, and he lives on McGregor Farm. And I stopped halfway in between, like in the middle of the bush, and I just bawled. And it was because I didn't know till that very moment in that first interview if what I was doing was the right thing, if I was the right person to do it, if there was anything meaningful that was going to come out of this work. So it was after that first interview, then I knew that I was on the right track. I was on the right path, and I just kept going. And so it just was a coincidence. I didn't select elders. I was told by my committee, you can only pick 3 people, and you can only pick 1 school for your master's because master's is smaller in scope. Mm-hmm. It just happened to be, I said, okay, well, the first few people I come across will be the ones I interview. They happen to be elders, and they happen to be people who were, key figures in the community or who did healing work. And so they worked on me when we sat together. Like we sat together for hours, and they worked on me in a way. So I grew a lot. They really just like the most painful things you think you want to bury that you don't want to bring up. They wanted me to just let things out. And so that set the whole tone for all the work that I do. So part of me was a little bit sad that going into the interviews now that people are primed and they're like, here's my story. Yeah. But I still get those moments where I can really connect with someone. And so that's the other thing that I do to deal with the pain of it or the heaviness is that I do language work. So I get to be part of the solution. I get to be part of the medicine. So I mentioned that I grew up Longhouse. Yeah. When I was in Cattery school, it was the same thing. Religious instruction was part of it in the 80s. My grandmother decided to retrace her roots, and she took us back to the Longhouse with her, and I was a little kid. And then I got to the point where I told my mom, I don't want to go to church anymore because I'm not a church person. So my mom wrote to the school and said, my daughter's not allowed to, don't make her go to church, don't make her go to religion class. So they piled all of us. It wasn't actually Longhouse class. I think it was called morals class. Okay. So there was Jehovah's Witnesses in there, a couple, and everyone who wasn't Catholic or Protestant was in there. So I just remembered how difficult it was. I still felt ostracized a lot. There wasn't a lot of Longhouse kids in the school when I was there. It still wasn't kind of the norm yet. It wasn't like the old days and the things I hear where they were like, there were 2 kids who were Longhouse in the whole school. It wasn't like that, but there still wasn't many. So I saw the change in the school system. I hear from people my age who will say, the first time I learned anything, language or culture, I learned it at school. And that's what it means to do this kind of this education reform. We want I don't want kids to have to choose. You guys both talked earlier about, it seems like you still have to choose, learn the language or learn French. And yeah. I don't want to choose. I don't want to choose between being Longhouse and educated. I'm Longhouse, I'm a second language learner, and I will have my PhD. I don't want our kids to have to choose.
And anything. They shouldn't have to. Mm-hmm. Just a little bit of my own experience. I went to Cattery school. The first time I ever stepped foot in a Longhouse, I was already 16 years old, and it was because I was a part of MAD Group. And MAD Group was a teen youth group here in the community that took us to the Longhouse for a ceremony. That was the first time I stepped foot in a Longhouse. So I didn't grow up with culture at all. And then straight from Cattery school, I actually went outside for high school too. So I went to Montreal for high school. Straight from Montreal, high school, I went to CEGEP, I went to university. I've been in Montreal in the city every single day since I was 12 years old. So that's my culture. Not really, but that's what I grew up knowing. I felt a massive disconnect from this community for a long long, long time.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not until I started to actually work here in the community full time, which is something I've always wanted to do. I went to school to work with community, to work with youth. So when I got here, I was kind of like, oh man, like I didn't fit in here either, because that's the change that we've seen here on the reserve, is that more kids are staying here to go to school.
Mm-hmm.
More kids are going to high school here. More kids are at the Longhouse. Ceremony's huge. We're just, it's flourishing in a way. It's thriving again. Like we relit the fire again. And that's something I didn't have, but something as an adult working with the community is that I have to teach myself now.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard. It's really hard. I've been on and off with a language course. I've been attending some ceremony to try to learn it because it's who I am.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to have to choose between who I am and, my education or my interests. Like, why can't people here mesh the two?
Mm-hmm.
And there are still some kids, that go to school off reserve. And that's fine too. But I noticed that these kids who are attending off reserve schools still have a lot of their culture,
Mm-hmm.
which is fantastic, right? Because that's what you want to see. So it's like there has been these positive shifts from when I went to high school in the 90s to kids going to high school now. And then,
Mm-hmm.
so like there's been changes, and I'm happy to see that there's changes.
Yeah. And it's a beautiful thing to see to, I put my kids in immersion schools. And so as a family, when you make that decision, then there's a commitment, because it means they will have challenges in English and French later on, potentially. And then I made sure they had the opportunity to go to survival school. I didn't get to go to survival school. I didn't have a choice in where I went to school, right? I was told you're going to Billings, and that was it. And so I went to Billings. So those are decisions we made for our kids. And, I wanted them to have the language, and to support that decision. That's why first I took parent classes at night, and then I went to Radiwananhirdats. Although I grew up going to the Longhouse, and, so I knew ceremony and different things, I didn't realize what I was missing in terms of learning who we are and knowing who we are, until I went to Radiwananhirdats and learned language. It's like I didn't know what I didn't know, right? So that changed things for me. And having children changed things for me too. My parents have 20 grandchildren already.
Wow.
Yeah. So, I was thinking about kind of the experience I wanted them to have, the way, the world I wanted them to grow up in. I wanted it to be different. And that means working on breaking cycles. That's the hardest realization I had in all of this work and all of that history that happened. Whether we like it or not, the burden is on our shoulders to break the cycles.
Yeah.
And to do something about all of this pain, because they're out there. They're certainly not going to be the ones that help us heal. And that was a hard thing for me to accept. It really became obvious to me some of the ways I'm perpetuating the cycle in my own home or in my own life, so addressing that has been difficult. And so I'm just like, this is kind of like my healing process too, going through all of this. And I want to be able to bring what I learn and what I find out in the archive and through the stories back to the community, because a lot of people, that culture of silence that's been around all of this,
Yeah.
we're grieving. There's a lot of shame too. And so we have to take the shame away from the people who didn't have a chance to learn culture, the people who don't speak the language. I speak to leaders in the community they've done all of these accomplishments. They work for community their whole life, and they'll still say, I feel like a failure because I don't speak the language. So that's a shame that we have to let go of. It doesn't belong to us. They did that to us.
Yeah.
And so those are some of the things I try to tell people. What I want to come out of my work is I'll be showcasing, all of the times, the different forms of resistance and all the efforts. And so it goes way deeper than 1969, what they tried to do to reform the schools and get the nuns out or protect the children. So our people have always tried. That's one thing, and just encouraging, taking the shame away and being more encouraging about learning language and culture.
Yeah.
Because, that's still a powerful thing that holds people back. My grandmother said she tried when she was 19 to go back to the Longhouse. And she said, because she didn't have a clan, whoever it was who greeted her there at the time turned her away. So then it wasn't until she was an elder that she went back again, and then was finally named the Longhouse and so on. And so she said, I wonder, what my life would have been like if they didn't turn me away. when I was 19. And so sometimes I wonder what my life would have been like if this history didn't happen, because then I wouldn't be doing research on this, and we wouldn't be doing, people put lifetimes into education reform and language revitalization. And as much as I love it, there's a grief in it.
There's definitely a grief.
Yeah.
I kind of feel like the healing process has maybe started. There's a long way to go, though, right? It's multiple generations of grief and trauma around this. But just the fact that the silence is broken, communication, there's so many learnings in that.
And I had a conversation with my mom and my sister a few years ago, and it was about some really big, dark issues. And we were all sitting around a table and we all shared experiences. And I said, if we could have had this conversation when I was a teenager, my life would have been different. If my mom could have been open with me about certain things, I said, these are the conversations people need to be having again. So that's what I hope happens, that there's good communication, because blowing this wide open there's cons to it too, the way it happened. Yeah.
There's still, negative feelings about it. There could still be violence about it. There's anger, there's sadness, and it's going to be expressed in so many different ways. So, but it's blown wide open. But how do we keep the fire, but controlled, So how do we keep, I don't know how to explain it. Like, how do we help everybody heal here? Like, cause everyone's wounds are just open now. So what do we do? What do we do here? We are doing some things already. There's a lot. You could see a shift in our children now, how they're a lot more open and they're validating their own emotions. And that's huge, right? To talk about emotions. I grew up in a household where we didn't talk about emotions because that's part of all this trauma, right? Like, there is some healing happening. There's still a long way to go.
There is. And everyone has to start somewhere. And I realized, because of spending half my childhood with my grandma Millie, she gave me a lot of tools that I think not many other kids are given when they're young. And not only bringing me back to the longhouse, but things we did that she normalized. So telling me community history, and we talked about emotions, and we talked about everything, and we burned tobacco every day. She was one of those people who would get up and burn tobacco in the morning, and we'd give thanks. She would tell me, if you don't want to give thanks out loud, because I was kind of a quiet kid. I'm like an introvert, a little shy. She would say, give thanks in your mind. And then she taught me how to use my mind. Like she said, if you're afraid, saying things in the language. If you feel like there's a negative entity around you, the words you would say in your mind, or you could say out loud, using tobacco. And I only realized in retrospect, I dealt with a lot of anxiety that way. She gave me all of these tools, and I've sat in circles with people, and I've had these like one-on-ones. And I realized, because of this history of schooling, a lot of our people, one of the things they lost was the ability to heal. They don't have practical tools. So they feel like, this is only something I can get from a doctor or a healer, or I have to go somewhere and get it. So that's one thing when I defended my master's thesis, there were some people in the room from the ed system. And I said, one of the things I recommend is that whatever we do in community, even in the education system, it needs to be trauma informed. You're talking about a community there's so many layers of trauma. So start giving kids, when they're little, normalize, whether it's burning tobacco or it's something else. They're
Tools,
debriefing.
Some kind of tool.
Sharing their feelings. Normalize it from when they're little in the school system. Give them some tools, and that'll make a difference. And the other thing I learned doing all of this work was, it matters what we tell our children about this history and our experiences, and when we tell them in their development. So you could do potentially a lot of harm to your child by either completely, shutting down and not telling them anything, but by giving them too much information or the wrong information at the wrong time. So they link this to the high rates of suicide in Indigenous communities or other issues in someone's lifetime. So yes, it's important for them to know about this history, but that strength-based approach, giving them tools and opportunities on how to cope with it, how to address it, is really important. And so I just think trauma-informed practice, in a holistic kind of sense in all aspects of our lives, is really important right now. And so I'm thankful to the people in the community, like there's Louise Mayo, who's an Indian day school coordinator, and she does wonderful work with the people who were claimants, and she and I work closely together. And there's a lot of elders doing work, and, you know, I'm working with an elder. So just to keep doing that good work,
Yeah.
you know, for people to support each other and to stop stigmatizing healing and health and well-being. And it's really important.
Yeah. And I think we're seeing a shift in that as well. Like we do actually have practitioners here that are now teaching, I forget exactly what the title of the training is, but it's like a 2-day intensive training about multi-generational trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And it's going into, I think it just hit all the major organizations here. So it's like it's going from the top levels down and going to be filtered out towards like the rest of the community at some point.
Mm-hmm.
But that too is going to make a major shift to just in the way that our organizations are thinking also. With everyone is coming from a trauma-based or trauma-informed place now in terms of making decisions and helping our people heal here. So I guess we're going to wrap up the episode. Does anyone have anything they would like to say just as a closing statement? Or Wahesu, would you have anything?
Well, I want to say thank you for having me. I want to say nyawako to the community for, you know, supporting the work that I do. Many people, you know, stop me and have positive things to say. And so I appreciate that encouragement. And to the people who are sharing their stories and opening up. So nyawako, you know, just for their strength here in Kahnawake, for everyone's strength. And that's in our history. I'm seeing it in writing, you know, and in the archives. And wherever I end up from here, I love doing this kind of work, and I'll always be working for the community one way or another. So, but Nyawa for having me.
Nyawa for coming in. Episode 1, a heavy topic to start off our podcast. Our next episode is going to be a little more lighthearted, dealing with we're entering October, so we're going to be doing something kind of spooky, right?
A little bit spooky, yeah. Our next episode coming up for October will actually be about Kahnawakes spooky stories and Kahnawakes legends, and we're going to be connecting that to the importance of oral tradition within our culture. So we're going to have some pretty neat collaborations, and I actually believe Merrick will be on with us too.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he is the best scary storyteller I know. So now everybody for being here. Thank you for tuning in to KCI Kindled, creating space for meaningful dialogue.
The views and opinions of the guests expressed in this podcast do not reflect those of Iorì and its employees.